Okay, so we are live now.
Okay.
Laso number lenge something touch the show you. Nga doji sete yi perance lu put one. Let me check if it is on. Okay. Number lenge touch the le ta ring anzu perance lu put so begi letting the tedongi letting you should sani ba cha yu. And the ringi letting the tola tanda flow of African imbe ani nganzu leguwa la nare ta kontar kura abzewa nganzu dus chi de shu che yu ani the ringi nganzu chudu di inke na la cha di du ngi inke na la shu chu wa che. Hi everyone, this is Dorjee Tseten, Students for Free Tibet Executive Director. So this is our SFT live episode 22nd. Since coronavirus pandemic and since the quarantine, we had started online digital campaign where we organized various talk on different issues, political issue, climate issue, human rights, culture, health. So we have been doing that, and this is our 22nd live episode of SFT. So today's live episode is a very special program, and it is about the topic of today's live program is Tibet's experience with Chinese imperialism, a lesson for African state, a discussion between Atabongwoung and Atabongwoung Gallous and Dorjee Tseten. So we are very, very happy to have a very special guest today for the program. I would like to quickly introduce our guests to the viewers. Hi Ata, can you hear me?
Yes, please, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm gonna introduce now our speaker to the viewers. Atabongwoung Gallous. Is it right? Did I pronounce right?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, so Ata is a PhD candidate at University of Pretoria, South Africa, and worked as a research assistant at Atabongwoung African Leadership Institute, University of South Africa, where he also served as a project coordinator of Atabongwoung African Leadership Institute Alumni Forum. Yeah, Alumni Forum. His other interests include African and European culture relation, where he obtained Master of Arts degree with distinction, memory studies in Africa, where he currently serves as a co-regional coordinator. He have done research work on Africa, political economy, thought leadership, and good governance for Africa, conflict resolution and peace building. He published book chapters, magazine articles, and edited many academic journal articles. He have done much work on human rights in Africa, working on the cause of Western Sahara. He is also a member of South African Association of Political Studies, South African Institute of International Affairs, and Memory Studies Association. He is the founder and chairperson of Africa Solidarity for Sahrawi, Living Stories and Memories, and Heart of Peace Foundation, and finally, Tibet Rescue Initiative in Africa. So welcome, Atta, to our SFT Live. We met first time last November in Dharamsala when you
Oh,
came
yeah.
with a delegation from African continent, African regions. So you basically based in South Africa, and
Yeah.
we had a discussion along with our Office of Tibet representative Mudubla from South Africa, and you had you had shown your interest, and since then you have been working very passionately, and you recently now founded rescue a new Tibet group, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and as someone who had worked with, someone who had experience such a vast experience on Africa, and now you have initiated Tibet Rescue Initiative in Africa.
In Africa.
It's a yeah, in Africa. It's a privilege and honor to have you. And I must also let you know that as we are trying to, learn from the Tibet experience on Chinese imperialism, I'm here also to learn from you and to the African politics and the situation right now, human rights situation. We hear a lot of things in news. So I'm very happy to have you here. Welcome to the SFT Live Show.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
As a great.
Hello.
Yes,
Can you hear
please.
me? I think.
Yes, I can.
Oh, I don't know if it's just me. I think there was some connection problem.
Okay.
So, so now, like, yeah, I would like to open the discussion. As of now, we have like over 70 people watching our live discussion from
Okay.
across the world, and I would like to now, like, open this discussion with your initial thought on all the overall situation of China-African relation and the situation right now. Basically, like, we know about the economy colonization happening. So what is the ground situation and how concerned people in Africa? So yeah, we would like to open with your opening remark.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dorjee. Let me say hi to all our viewers around the world that are connected live with us at this point in time for such an interesting topic on Tibet experience of Chinese imperialism, a lesson that Africa can learn. I think before I start to say anything, Dorjee, I think due diligence will let me first create some sort of a scenario, a background to the presentation that I'm going to make. Because if I don't create a background, whatever question that I intend to answer will create some form of, it's going to dilute the understanding of whatever I will try to do, because for you to understand Chinese imperial design in Africa, you must understand the nature of Africa as a continent and the people of Africa as a collective. Now, Africa, as of now, is made up of officially 54 states. There is one state that is still hanging that must make it 55. That state is the Western Sahara, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which is a state that is under occupation by a neighboring African country by the name of Morocco. Now, let me keep that aside. It's not, an issue for today. Now, Africa is struggling with what I describe as divisive sameness. Now, by divisive sameness, what do I mean? I mean to say, when you look at Africa from outside, it is a whole. But within it, it has so much barriers and divisions that fights against the collective homogeneity of the entire Africans and Africa as a continent. Now, if you look, for example, you take each African state, in as much as they might be connected by a lingua franca that is official, that everybody speaks, whether it's French or English or Spanish. If you look at the nature of that country itself, it is made up of a variety of ethnic states, in other words, tribes. Now, each tribe has a lingua franca, meaning it has a language. It occupies space in that country. It practices a particular culture, and it has a unique orientation in terms of philosophical or how their identity, the metrics that make up their identity. So this is entirely how Africa is in all this complexity. Now, because of this, the nature of Africa, you realize that issues such as corruption is so embedded in the system that its democracy, for example, is strongly based upon ethnic chauvinism, meaning because somebody comes from my tribe, I have the obligation to vote that person in power because I see the other tribes in the same geographic space as the enemy or the other in terms of otherness. Now, within this context, corruption, of course, we understand weakens state institutions that must function for the well-being of the people. So, my brother, this is where the Communist Party then sees an opportunity, an advantage, and leverage on that to exploit the people of Africa to what I would describe as an imminent catastrophe. Because what the Communist Party is doing, before I even talk about the Chinese Communist Party, let me say this. Whatever China is offering in Africa is not new. Africa don't need that. Africa has so much engineers that could construct the roads, the football stadiums, the infrastructures that the Chinese are offering. But the logic of what I am going to talk to connect China today is that they came up with an economic strategy that they describe it to be win-win, a win-win policy. And of course, they accused the Western governance system of failing the Africans in the sense that they offer loans that end up in corrupt pockets. I mean, African leaders, there's a lot of corruption among them. So they then said, we have a good deal for you, Africa. We will adopt a strategy which is called win-win, meaning we win, you win. And how did they package this strategy? They packaged it in a sense that the Chinese government will build a football stadium or construct a road in exchange for mineral resources. Now, this is problematic because how do you evaluate a quantity of resources that is equal to a building or a football stadium? Now, we understand that this is a kind of logic of barter trade that the Africans understood. Long ago, Africans were trading in this particular way, but it was not in a large scale. It was basically a peasant kind of trade that it was done among individuals and among families, not among nations or among probably ethnic collectives. So in this win-win that the Chinese has been propagating over time, they will build a football stadium or construct a road in exchange for mineral resources. Now, within this particular context, they bring their laborers from China And mind you, the Chinese are able to deliver systematically different categories of deliverables. Meaning, if they have to build a road, for example, in Nigeria, the quality of the road will never be like a road that they will build probably in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, or probably in Berlin, in Germany. Meaning the ones that is built in Africa is always of an inferiority. The outside of it may look beautiful, may look attractive, but it never stays. It never takes long before it gets destroyed. So in this manner of them practicing trade between China and African state, one of the things also that is problematic is the fact that China does not trade with Africa as a continent. It trades with individual states. And of course, the economic strength of individual African countries cannot match up to the strength of, China's economy. So, to bring the issue of corruption that I touched before going this far, is to say that because of the corrupt nature of politics in Africa, Beijing has leverage on that, in the sense that it looks into opportunities where it can offer so much loans to African states, because there are a lot of, almost all the African states owe so much money to China. And mind you, African states don't need money, because you cannot give money to a people that are not able to use money for its intended purpose. For you to give so much money to a people that you knew that their problem is corruption is just so amiss. So they offer all this loan to African states, understanding and knowingly that the loan is going to end up in private pockets, and some of them even take the loans and invest them back in European banks. And why is China doing that? They do so such that at the end, they may enact strong deals with African states to say, for example, because you cannot pay this loan, give us this particular source of mineral wealth that we may exploit over time to be able to regain our debt. If you go to Angola, Angola is an oil-rich country in Africa. China built a new city in Angola. Now, the average Angola doesn't make so much money to be able to pay rent in that particular city. So what then happened is, after the city was built, you never find people who were able to pay the cost of their rent. And the same city that was built and all the buildings were left abandoned because they were expensive for a people of that nature who don't have so much income. It's the same thing they did for Cameroon. Cameroon was supposed to host the last African Nation Cup championship. And at the same time, Cameroon was experiencing a civil war. And a lot of people were saying, including international agents, were proclaiming that Cameroon is not ready to host such level of championship because of issues of insecurity. Now, because China understands that Cameroon was trying to host the African Nation Cup as a symbol for global appearance, to show forth that there is peace in Cameroon, they offered so much debt to Cameroon. And because of insecurity, the championship was withdrawn from the Cameroon government. They were stripped off from the license, the host license. They could not host the championship because of issues of insecurity. The stadiums, the football stadiums that were built were not completed. The money that was given could not be accounted for. And now they are negotiating deals such as owning oil refinery, and so on, in exchange of, the money that they have given to the Cameroon government. It's the same thing in Zambia. It's the same thing almost everywhere in Africa. You find this particular strategy of a win-win that is dealing with a lot of African states today. Because if it's financial resources, Beijing has the money. Let's not say things that are inaccurate. It's accurate to confirm that they have the money. But the strategy, the way they conduct their economic encounters is what I will semantically describe as diabolos, meaning it has a hidden and a dark agenda inside of it. Because you see, my comrade, Africa is the only continent that is constantly under pressure. Pressure from who? Not from Africans, but from external forces. Because of the natural endowment that is in Africa. The football stadiums and the roads and the infrastructures that China offers and constructs in Africa. I mean, Africa has a lot of engineers that can do all these things. But because China understands that the weakness of Africa is in twofold, the issue of divisive sameness, that Africans are struggling to put their acts together. They are struggling to rise up as a strong homogeneous collective because of the various fragmentation in terms of lingo, in terms of culture, in terms of colonial influence. The Beijing government therefore leverages and benefits in all these loopholes to create a trap for African states to be continually in a position of weakness, such that they could exploit the mineral resources over and over. Because the strength of China, I can tell you in public, is in Africa. The minerals to turn the machines, the industrial complex in China working utmost for economic of scales. That's why you find all these things that are happening and more. That's the reality of it.
Thank you, Ata, for giving a very clear picture of what is happening in Africa. Africa comprised of 54 states, right? It's a very big continent, and with so much different culture and history, and but at the same time, as per your presentation, we can rightly say there's an economy colonization, a new way of colonization happening in Africa by China. And there's a dark agenda. I think you mentioned there's a dark agenda behind, and that need to be exposed, that African people should know. So today's live discussion, as we are learning from Tibet's experience of occupation of Tibet by China, when you share about the African story, it reminds me of what happened in Tibet 70 years ago. So when Tibet was invaded by China, it wasn't the military invasion first. It was more like in a very, very cunning way, the way we are seeing right now in Africa, where China will project as a win-win proposition and then saying how it will benefit Tibetans. and they will say they will build road, they will build infrastructure, and they will bring change, education in the community. And in this process, they try to identify who are the community leader, who are the people who have influence in the community, either by trapping them in their in this trap, in this strategy that they planned, or they try to
yeah,
or they try to find.
kickbacks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
kickbacks
Or
and
they,
bribery, my brother.
yeah, and then try to find who they can bribe. Basically, try to explore that way, and that happened to Tibet. And when Tibetans realized, that we cannot take it more now, we have to stand up. There wasn't much time for Tibetans. Even then, Tibetans have rose up. There was a uprising across Tibet, but finally in 1959, Tibet was completely occupied by China. So we are trying to
Exactly.
share this experience to the world, and we have been doing that for the last 60 years. So today, if you Google, if you watch news, you will hear what is happening on Indo-Tibet border in India right now. There's a standoff between Indian army and Chinese military, and there was a recent intrusion from the Chinese military from the northern part of India, Ladakh, and as per the news, 20 Indian military men were killed in this recent conflict that happened last Monday, only 2 days ago. And this is one of the brutalest kind of attack on Indian sovereignty over after 45 years. After 45 years, there was an Indo-China war in 1962, but after that there were a lot of negotiation. But at the same time, we are now asking this question. Indian masses are asking this question: why this is happening at first place? Why China is claiming all this northern part of India from Ladakh to Arunachal? And what China says is, after the occupation of Tibet, and because of Tibet's occupation, they claim this part because this area share very deep culture, religion with the Tibetan culture, all these northern part of Himalaya. And China, Mao Zedong has rightly said, when he invaded Tibet, he said Tibet is the palm, and then all this area, right? Ladakh, Sikkim, Arunachal, Bhutan, all those are fingers. And once we get the palm, we will get the fingers. So,
Obviously.
so now there's a realization also going on more and more in the Indian public, it was a mistake to let China, occupy Tibet. They should have rose up, they should have stand up with Tibet. So China greets the Chinese communist imperialism right now, the expansionist view, the greed never fail. And when they occupy Tibet, now they are reaching out to, the Himalayan, this Indian territory. And we know that they are claiming South China Sea. They are claiming Taiwan, what is happening in Hong Kong. So that kind of expansion is the policy that China has adopted beyond its boundary and has reached to Africa now, and trying to control and use their economy power, because in this 21st century now, it might be not possible to invade militarily the way that they did in Tibet 70 years ago. But what they are doing is a new way of colonization. So I think there are a lot of things to learn and share. But today, as I share a few things about Tibet, and also I want to share later on, I can show some pictures of how Tibetans are continuously resisting Tibetan Chinese occupation and fighting for Tibet's freedom. So after 70 years of occupation, Tibetans are continuously fighting for freedom. So that's a resistance story. Yeah, they are resistance stories, and later on I can share some pictures. But right now I think let's focus more on the on Africa and your experience, because a lot of people need to learn. So we have around now like 70 people watching live, and we can also take question from people as we speak. I just saw a comment while you are talking. I have to also watch the screen here. I just saw a comment from Benavshin Zand. I think he's from Iran. So it mentioned like the same as Iran. We Iranian activists are being put through the same thing by Chinese government as in Africa and in Tibet. So I know, like, China tried to reach out to all these like countries and try to build their bloc, but at the end, in the process, the people who are really working for human rights, they can see that. So you as a human rights activist, what is the situation of basic human rights? Of course, like business and trades are being done, like, but we are seriously hearing the violation of human rights of people who are working on this project. So what is the situation?
The situation has not changed. Remember, the political philosophy of communist China is that they don't believe on issues that have to do with human rights. Now, the way China operates, there is a contrast between the way China operates in Europe and the way they operate in Africa. And of course, Africa is that political landscape, that open zone, meaning anything from anybody can happen in Africa. Because even the people that are working with Chinese associates in Africa, they have so much of a hard time. And even African government understand that. Let me take you to the scenario that happened just around the COVID-19, the issue of the African migrants in China. Mm-hmm. We have so much videos that portray the inhumane treatment that were meted upon them by Chinese citizens and members of the government of China. Now, the sad story, comrade, is that one would have expected some sort of a collective voice from the African Union, but it was not so. It was individual states in Africa that stood to be lone rangers to see into the problem and to deal with it from an interstate base. For example, in Ghana, the Chinese embassy was convocated. In Rwanda, the president there is very progressive thinking. I think at some point, he even had to deport some Chinese handmen who were living in Rwanda. So it's to say that because of weak political and human rights institutions in Africa, the Africans, individuals, have not been able to get to that point where they can seek judicial justice for themselves. Because, like you rightly said, the penetration of China into Africa is the same scenario in Tibet. They appear like Messiah that want to better the life of the people and the Chinese people without propagating any sign of any harm. And then when they get into the environment, they try to understand the dominant culture in that place. If they find weak institutions, they make the institutions weaker. If they find corrupt individuals, they make them more corrupt. Because with China, it's the same thing that is happening even there in China. It's the communist warlords in Beijing that reap the most of the benefit of a good life in China. It's not about the peasants who live in various suburbs. It's the same strategy that they are doing in Africa, identifying people of influence, people who have strong voices in their community, and try to make their life better, and they become puppet of China's, and they begin to exchange love letters with China's, begin to blow all this trumpet how China is this messiah in comparison to North America and so forth. But in reality, the human rights situation has not changed, because the danger is that the more China penetrates into the society, if we are not careful, if Africa is not awake, they will be appointing people that must represent various communities in Africa. In Zambia, there is a Chinese police station there. In South Africa, at some point, they wanted Mandarin to be taught in South African schools. Until some of us academics, we started writing and publishing to say until when with such colonial hypnotism will end. That after struggling, battling with the giggles of English language, you are now forced to learn Chinese Mandarin. I mean, South Africa has so much languages. Why not allow the people to learn their language? Because the language of a people is an exact expression of who the people are. So you find this dichotomy in different places in Africa, just because of the strength and the presence of China. The human rights issue is just out of question. Individuals are trying. The more you try, the more it becomes blurred. Why? Because not everybody sees things in the same light. Some of us are very active in what we are doing, and it is our duty to continue to echo, to say Africa embracing China, having an entanglement with China is a danger. In the same way the Tibetans woke up only to see that they were dealing with the devil. If Africans are not careful, it's the same way they will get up one day and realize that they have been dealing with the wrong cloud so far. Because even you look at Chinese economic development vision and strategies, there's nothing in for Africa. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative that started, I mean, it was a flare. It became a flower from 2013. What is in Africa? You cannot tell me that Africa needs a road from Beijing to Cape Town when there is no road between Nigeria and Ghana, which are neighboring countries. There is no road between Congo, Brazzaville and Gabon, which are neighboring countries. Because if, for example, there is a political crisis in Gabon, the easiest place for civilians to flee in refuge will obviously be Congo, Brazzaville, not Beijing. So it will make more sense to construct proper interstate roads that link countries to one another, so that trade among these collectives can flourish. But an agenda to build a road from Beijing to Cape Town is hyper problematic. It doesn't make sense. The only sense of it is an imperial agenda. Is to have quick access to plunder resources in and out at your will, at nobody's cost. So that's all I can say, my brother. The human rights situation, we are still struggling, we are still battling as Africans, because the light has not yet shone into the minds of many millions of Africans. They still hail this China because the Africans who see China as a good weapon are the ones that China has in their bags. Those ones that they invite in Beijing and give them 5-star treatment and put money in their account, they are the ones. Because one of the danger that some of us are very scared is that the philosophy of African communalism is drifted gradually to a kind of interactive China-African individualism, individuals dealing with Beijing, they deal mostly on an individual base. If you go to Rwanda, they have a good leadership there, a thought leadership. He's one of the presidents in Africa who refused the various loans that Beijing was giving to African states. It does not make sense to keep giving somebody money that the person end up mismanaging the money. If you keep forcing it, it's an abuse in itself. So that's the situation. The human rights condition is still there. Even Africans who are working for Chinese people in Africa are being maltreated. I mean, they treat them as, nobodies. Their labor rights are not respected. So it's all these hell of things.
Mm-hmm. As you share this grave situation now in Africa over the years, you also mentioned about Ghana, how progressive people and leadership are also now realizing it and pushing back. So I think as much as things look difficult, I can see hope and resistance happening. The Chinese lie is being exposed, especially with the coronavirus now, that has endangered the whole world. Over almost 500,000 people lost their life because of the coronavirus pandemic, and this was basically because of mishandling of the Chinese government. Has directly responsible for such a situation. Over I just checked, over almost 8 million people are infected with this disease. And during this time, as you mentioned, how Africans people, innocent people, face racism from the Chinese government and people in China, that has been widely known and has drawn global attention, and as well as a lot of African community. But at the same time, we know China is very smart in dealing the way they want to achieve. More works need to be done. But then I thought to now ask you a question regarding African history and African culture. So because for Tibetans, when we think about Africa, first thing came in our mind is Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and there's so many other resistance going on. You mentioned about the Sahara Freedom Movement, right? Is going on. West Sahara Freedom Movement that is going on. We know about it. And in general, in Africa has a very strong culture of resistance and fighting for the just cause, which we really resonate with Tibetan struggle, and that's why I feel there is a link that can be done. There are common things that Tibetans, even Tibet and Africa is far away. Africa is a big state with 54 states, but Tibet can directly connect with the stories of resistance and stories of fight against injustice. So can you share a little bit about that and how you had this interest, get this interest of working for Tibet or working with Tibet activists, and now you have founded a Tibet organization in Africa, and in your organization you also put a mission about establishing Students of Free Tibet network in African region. So we're going to work on that, but I want to ask about the story of African resistance and your personal story of how you get connected with the movement and why you get involved in the movement.
Thank you so much, Dorjee. That's a very important question that you've posed. Look, my brother, the Tibetan struggle and the African struggle is just the same thing. Oppression is one. Colonization is one thing. Imperialism is the same. It may change according to form, according to type, but the psychosocial damage that it caused on its victim, it's the same across the lines of the globe. For example, if you look at the case of South African, apartheid was a different form of colonialism where the settler and the native shared the same geographic space but had these thin borderlines that were not allowed to interact. Tibet might be far from Africa, but I can assure you, the Africans will easily be connected to the Tibetans than any race on earth. The reason is simple. If you have never been oppressed, you can never speak a contextual language for the oppressed. Because for you to talk on the behalf of the oppressed, you must have experienced oppression yourself. You must know the workings of oppression before you can be able to properly, contextually advocate for somebody to be free from oppression. It's the same thing that happened in Tibet, is the same thing that happened in Africa. Now, the only difference is that Tibetans, they have only one oppressor, which is China. But in Africa, they have a variety of oppressors with identity of different lingua francas. Now, for example, the French colonization in Africa is different from the British colonization in Africa. It's different from the Spaniards and the Portuguese. In the French colonization, for example, they practiced what was called the policy of assimilation. What does the policy of assimilation mean? Assimilation meant make French-speaking African natives to forget about their culture identity and to behave exactly like Frenchmen. They must speak like Frenchmen, they must dress like Frenchmen, they must practice the culture rituals that is being practiced in Paris. Whereas the British colonial style was different in the sense that they adopted a policy that was called indirect rule. Now, a lot of people have different, pictures or explanation to the British indirect policy. But the essence was that the British did not want to be so much involved in the native affairs. Hence, they collected a handful of headsmen to speak on behalf of the native. Now, this lens of the British indirect rule is what Beijing copies, but in a different form. Because Chinese never accept that Africans can become like them. That's why you find all the treatment of Africans, the wrong treatment Africans suffered in China. But there is a context where, in the context where Chinese wants to gain from Africa, they bring anthropological, argument that both Africans and Chinese are cousins, which all these things are just, political jargons for people to manifest their interest. So what I'm saying here is that each colonial influence in Africa must be seen within a different historic context and time. And the nature of manifestation was completely different. Like if you look at the wars of liberation, I don't want to call it the wars of independence or freedom, because there is a difference between liberation and freedom. Freedom is the ability to make decisions without any external influence. Liberation is the ability to make decisions with the help of external influence. Now, a lot of people misconceptualize this notion to think that Africans are independent or Africans are free. Africans are not free. Africans were only liberated from the yoke of physical colonial burden But the mental colonialism did not come out of them, because mental colonialism can only come out when the people achieve freedom, which is the ability to stand on an independent decision without the influence of any person. Now, if you take the case, for example, of Algeria in North Africa, during the wars of liberation, the French colonial force massacred millions of Algerians. Committed a high level of manslaughter. It's the same thing that happened in Lusophonic colonies, colonies that previously belonged to Portugal and those of Spain. Now, in the British, it was not so much as what happens in France, because one of the advantages during the colonial adventures was that the British had so much influence in the global political landscape. They were involved in India. They were involved as far as Hong Kong, and see the mess they left in Hong Kong and see what is happening today. So it's that kind of thing, because they were so much involved, more than the French. At certain point, they were easily and willingly ready to let go some of the previous colonies. Now, the nature of all this, like I can say, is just one and the same thing. The Tibetans are oppressed. They are displaced from their land. And if you want to look at it in international jurisprudence, it's a problem, because self-determination, which is an international law principle, says for any people to advocate for self-determination, they must have a population, they must have a geographic space, they must be able to govern themselves. The Tibetans have proven to be able to govern themselves. They have a geographic space, they have a population. So why then is it that what the international community has agreed upon, which is issues pertaining to self-determination for a people, cannot be applied? It's the same issue that is happening with Africa, the issue of double standard. That the case of Western Sahara still remains a political hangover, because in spite of all the evidence and that have been tabled, Morocco still stands on a false occupational claim that the Western Sahara is part of Morocco. It's the same thing like Tibet. That China says Tibet is part of China. But if you look at the Tibetan history, you will see the Tibetan currency. You will see all this historic archive that says no, there is no nation that we have two different currencies. If Tibet was part of China, there would never have occurred in any historic time that Tibet had a legal tender that was official for the Tibetan people. So this is the problem, my brother, that we are facing as global human rights upright individuals. The Tibetan story is an African story. Africans will easily connect to the Tibetan stories. The Tibetans must only identify individual countries in Africa that were pillars in the liberation struggles of other African countries and start speaking with them. They will understand your story. Because the gain or the opportunity that I as an individual I see in the Tibetan story is that it is going to awaken the African mind. Because the danger with history is that in as much as history reminds us of the comedy and the tragedy of the past, as individuals, we easily forget history until the same scenario repeats itself. Then we begin to look for our historic archives to be remembered upon what has happened to us. Because by you telling the Tibetan story in Tanzania, for example, how the Chinese entered Tibet in the form of development, in the form of we want to partnership to have a better community. It's the same way the win-win economic strategy is penetrating. Because if you look at, of course, if I have to go if I have to say more on this, if you look at the things that China is offering to Africa, these are things that Africans can offer for themselves. The roads, Africans have engineers. The football stadium, doesn't mean that Africans love football. You build a football stadium to a people who cannot feed themselves. Where would they get money to buy football tickets? So it's just to tell you that there is an overlap somewhere. Something is missing somewhere. Because it doesn't make sense. Whatever they offer to Africa, Africans can do it. But because Africans accept these things only because individuals in Africa are making so much profit in this China-Africa relationship. Those ones that we call them puppets. And they are the ones that whatever we do in public, we try to sink it into their minds so that there must be a conscious awakening. Because there is nothing that Africans cannot do for themselves. They have the manpower, they have the skills, they have the schools, they have everything that they need for the African revolution or emancipation. They don't need anything from China. That's a simple but honest truth.
Yeah, that's true. And I think you rightly said someone who had gone through operation will understand what operation is, what suffering is. And that's how you connected with the story of Tibet. And you made a very strong point that Tibetans should also now tell this story to all the African countries, to the people in different states, and connect with them directly. Because there's a question rightly asked, which I want to ask, and then I think you have already touched on the answer, but I want to ask again here from Lingsal Lamo. She asked, those last years, many Africans nations saw China as a very interesting alternative partners and saw a way to emancipate from many Western countries, especially from European countries. This was very beneficial for China, especially at UN Human Rights Commission, where most of the African countries were very supportive to China in order to make obstacles to any resolution condemning China for their human rights record. Do you think we can hope for any changes in the future of any African countries? So basically, she's also bringing this, discussion in UN. So UN, every member state has a vote, right? And I remember in 2013, I went to Geneva to attend a Human Rights Council meeting, and I can see very clearly there's a bloc, and China has really get all the smaller countries in there, and then use it as their own Chinese bloc. So the question is, will it change now because of so much information coming out?
I can just give a straight answer to that question. Yes, it will change. Look, every society or every community, look at every community in two ways. Look at it in specific historic era and at specific time. Now, among other things that Africans are dealing today is the issue of regressive leadership. Those African leaders that have been in power for too long, that are not beneficiary to the people anymore, that have rather become a danger to the existence of their own people. Now, as time goes on, one thing is for sure, that Africans are not remaining the same. Africans are progressing. Now, we'll be able one day, I can tell you, to be able to deal with this leadership decay that we are suffering today as Africans in Africa. Now, when this cloud is removed, we will be able to have progressive African thinkers at different levels of government. Now, this particular issue on China versus human rights abuses will come to a spotlight, because when you talk of the scenario you saw in Geneva, my brother, when you saw the bunch of African states voting for China, look at these African states in the context of puppets, individuals who have taken financial gains from Beijing. They don't speak on behalf of the African people. They speak on behalf of them, individuals, and their bank account. Now, there is a time that this particular wind will blow. You will have progressive thinkers in Africa. I can tell you, if you go to Rwanda, the president there is a progressive thinker. It's one of Africans that maintains the dignity of Africans. Now, if you go to Rwanda, the case study there between Rwanda-China relationship is a different ball game. It's one of no human right abuse. You cannot be a Chinese in Rwanda and you abuse a Rwanda. You are deported back to China the next day that comes. Now, we are gradually gaining access to this particular type of leadership. And for the question that our friend, colleague has asked, is to say, time in itself is progressive, and time or progress comes with time. But there will be a time, as long as we keep propagating the message, telling the people to understand, because the people can see for themselves. The only issue is that the people in power, the people in governance, are the ones that are in bed with China, not the African masses. That is why you see China has different strategies to conquer and rule different institutions in Africa. In the university, which is a free space, then they come up with the Confucius Institute to only target the academia, so that they must not be outspoken. They must not say what is real. They must not say what is visible. And in the same way, you find them in different strategies in different places. And mind you, like somebody mentioned, with China, their strategy comes with a lot of patience. But so far, they have proven not to miss their targets. They take time, they go slow, but surely, and they hit the target. So, from this new awakening that is coming, I'm not the only progressive African thinker that is speaking in this way. There are a lot of them who are also seeing the things that the influence of China is causing. Because Africa for China is a dumping site. Even domestic industries are not able to function at economies of scales because Chinese products are occupying everywhere. And one of the ways to strengthen imperialism in any country is to stop them from the ability to produce the things they need by themselves, which some scholars would describe as overdependence. If they can overdepend on you, you have gained them. And that is the strategy China is using. What makes them think we cannot build the roads that they are building? Because if it needs repair work, they must bring back the company from Beijing to come and repair. Now, what is that saying sent to you? It's a signal that sends to the African mind with damages, because it reduces their esteem, that ability that we can do this by ourselves. And this is only allowed by individual Africans, not Africans. Because everywhere in Africa, they complain, for example, when Chinese projects are taking place, even the least qualified maneuver workman is an expatriate from China. And people ask questions to sit, but why? Are there not laborers around here? Now, why do they do this? Because most of their construction sites are always enclaved. Why do they do this? They do this because it's a practice of dominance. It's a practice to enforce colonialism, imperialism in all its ways. So, the simplest question is yes, our colleague, these things will change time. That's why we keep talking. That's why we keep speaking to the African minds.
Thank you so much, Ata. I think this was really thought-provoking, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and also to share the real, what do you call it, like feeling or thinking of African people on the ground. And I must say, the Tibetan freedom movement has been like growing strong all this year, not because we have support from any state or like government, but more than that, it is the people, like, who had supported the movement, the Just Cause of Tibet, and people has really then like built this like grassroots support, which has then like pressure the government and leaders to take a stronger stand for Tibet. So ultimately, I think it is the people which change the government, which makes the decision, which pressure to make the decision. And as you rightly said, how African people are thinking, and because of that, you are seeing the change, which is really, really positive to hear. But at the same time, individual like yourself is really important. I see very important and taking very important role in whole this like movement. As you had now started this like organization, right? Tibet organization, and you're trying to mobilize more people in this group and other Tibet groups in the African continent. So then we become more strong. We become a movement, and then we reach out to the people, to the intellectual, to the students, to the human rights activists, to the journalists who can really make change, who can really bring those thinking and expose China's this dark, you mentioned like this dark kind of like approach.
Dark hand.
Yeah, that's it, and to expose that. So I think that is happening, and I must say that Tibet and Africa has a very long relation, and there's an Office of Tibet in South Africa for over like few decades, and there's a reason why there's an Office of Tibet in South Africa, and to basically oversee like African continent and reach out to African people. And our president Sejong Lobsa Senge has made a couple of visits in African countries, and during his visit there were a lot of like protests by Chinese on his visit to Africa. So I can understand how threatened they are, and they can see how they are threatened, and they don't want us to build this alliance. That's why they try to stop us, but they cannot. Of course, like His Holiness Dalai Lama has expressed his wish to visit South Africa and African countries. Unfortunately, because of like those leaders who had now like bent on China and basically like basically move away from what South Africa had stood up for the justice, right, during the anti-apartheid movement, and now they try to work with China, and then like they are not even able to welcome His Holiness Dalai Lama, which is very sad. But I think when there is a movement we can build in the people, it will change the government position.
It will definitely change, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think last year there was a visit from our Speaker of Parliament, Pema Junior to Africa. I think it was his first time visiting African continent. So I think there's a collaboration work going on, and you and me, as an activist and people has to be more connected and be more organized. Those, like, events and partnership to mobilize people and expose those Chinese lies. Yeah, please,
Yeah,
Ada,
that's very
what you're
important.
saying.
Yeah. No, I was just saying that's very important because, like I mentioned earlier, we misbehave today because sometimes, or for one reason or the other, we forget our history. But rest assured that with history, it's very important to always remind people of their history, because over time we've understood how much history has influenced the present decision of individuals and collectives. Now, when people begin to misbehave, it's because they are disconnected from the history. Because as a truism, nobody that has ever suffered oppression to remove their eyes from people that are facing similar oppression today. It's something that must never happen. Because the global story is the same. It's just happening at different times. Now, when we begin, for example, to see horrible videos and images of bad things happening across the globe, it's not to say bad things have not been happening. It's just to say the same bad things that were happening that people could not see at the same time have been videoed now and is coming to everybody. So history is some kind of a mirror. Now, when people are liberated from their history from their story of oppression, the thing is they easily get comfort or comfortable with their actual state of life. But when a Tibetan comes and tells them that so and so in Tibet committed self-immolation as his own contribution for advocating for the freedom of Tibet, then it spines a message in their mind to say, oh, so and so of my own died because of their contribution to our struggle for liberation. So what I'm saying here is that the Tibetans can help Africa in this role to be able to start lobbying, visiting African collectives, and sharing the Tibetan experience. Because the Tibetan experience, man oh man, Africans know it better. Because the African story has been episode of tragedies, from human commodification to colonialism, to neo-colonialism, to rising dictatorship that must sustain colonial empires, to tribal factions and ethnic cleansing. These are traumatic experiences. But whenever there is an iota of peace, people then tend to forget this experience. But look here, every collective is made up of their experience as a family and their experience as a nation. And any nation that does not build its story upon its socio-political experiences is bound to fail. It's not because we are liberated that we must start living like free men. No. Because there's one thing to liberate people from servitude. There's another thing to take servitude out of them. So, this is what I'm saying, my friend. The Tibetans must help Africans in telling their stories to remind Africans where they are coming from. Because so far, many Africans have lost it. They thought they were born free men. That's not true. And whenever you forget your story, it repeats itself. That is why Chinese invasion of Africa, although it's a different form, It's a repetition of history. When they begin to say, you must teach Mandarin in your schools, these are all signs of imperial agenda. Because what happens in the colonial epoch in Africa is that Africa was stripped off from their own languages. And you can only best express yourself by your language. And that is why Tibetan language is under threat. Because as long as you keep speaking Tibetan language, it keeps reminding you that you are Tibetan. I'll give you a story, my comrade. We were involved in the liberation struggle of East Timor against Indonesia. And I got this story from my friends who went to supervise the referendum that took place in East Timor. Now, my friend, Advocate Jose Nascimentos, told me this story. He's Portuguese, but he was present in the referendum. I was, doing other things by then. He said when they arrived in East Timor on the day or the night before the referendum, you could not see any signboard or signpost that speaks about the referendum or that urges people to vote for self-determination, because the Indonesians, towards the end of the colonial project in East Timor, the issue became so brutal that the Timorids were very scared. But guess what? On the day of the referendum, they voted an outright majority for self-determination. Now, what I'm trying to see here is that no matter what China does in Tibet, just take a ballot box and put on a table and ask the people, do you want to vote to become independent or do you want to vote to join China? I can bet you on my father's tomb, all the Tibetans will vote for an outright self-determination to be independent. Because you cannot, identity of a people or of a collective, it's not something that is borrowed. It's not an aesthetic that you infused into individuals. It's something that they acquired by nature through birth. They are born with it. They are born Tibetans. So it's the same thing that we are saying. You guys must help Africans to remember where they come from. If it is so much awake in their mind, this Chinese penetration, I can tell you, will not be happening. The Rwandans had a genocide in 1994 where the majority Hutu tribe did some kind of ethnic cleansings against the Tutsi. Now, if you go to Kigali, you find the museum, you look at the scores of people that were killed in the genocide. The genocide is just, I think I can say, 2 decades and more ago. Is still fresh in the minds of Rwandans. Rwandans are able to be identified in Rwanda as Rwandans and not Hutus or Tutsi. Now, a lot of African countries had their independence in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. This is more than 33 decades ago. Generations, the older generation that were so conscious. The majority have left, they have died. And gradually, it is slipping away out of the African mind. It needs an awakening. A people who are experiencing such a particular situation, to come back to them to say, look, this thing is still real, it's not dead. Look, imperial dominance is still here. It just changes its metrics, its form. but it's still alive. The project is still alive and strong. Because you look at the corrupt politicians in Africa, most of them take from China without thinking what happened to their descendants, their offsprings. Because the youth in Africa, for example, are suffering because of the decisions that people made for them. And gradually, African youth are gaining knowledge. And there will be a time, I can tell you, that these things will have a change.
Thank you. I think that's a very, very inspiring way to end our discussion here. You have given example of East Timor, which is the youngest, like we can say, like, country in the world. And I think what you said in your example that anything can happen, right? We were being told like, oh, Tibet will never be free, China is so powerful, whatnot. But it is the Tibetans, if we don't give up our hope and continue to fight, there is a resistance going on. And now we are seeing like whole world is like, awakening. And more importantly, Tibetans and Uyghurs, they are like over like millions of Uyghurs behind concentration camp. Hong Kongers are also fighting for their freedom. Chinese democracy activists are also fighting for their freedom and democracy. Southern Mongolian, Taiwanese, so people who have been oppressed by China. Right now, what we see China in this map, over 60% of like the actual land is occupied from different countries and different people. So people are rising up, and we are seeing the hope. And most importantly, when you are saying your experience, what reminds me of a quote from Margaret Mead, which says like, never doubt a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So basically, we can never doubt ourselves what we can do. A small group of individuals are thoughtful can change the world, and that has happened in the world. So now, like, we are not just like small group of people, we are a movement. Tibetans and supporters around the world are calling for freedom, and Tibetans are ready to work with the African, our brothers and sisters, to expose and to work together to really build, and then to rise against Chinese growing influence and expansionist like policy that they have adopted. So we can definitely do that. I want to ask if you have any last thing to say. Otherwise, I just want to show one picture of resistance inside Tibet, and then I thought to end this discussion here.
If just in one sentence is just to encourage the Tibetan resilience and to tell them to say, look, in every historic time, there is a new way of doing things. Probably China keeps possessing this growing influence because it has strong supply base in Africa to keep its industrial project running. Now imagine if this supply base begins to collapse, because in every country in Africa there is a controversial Chinese project there. The mentioning of the name of China is an instrument that divides people. Some people say yes, we want China because they are corrupt. Some other people say no, we don't want China, we can do it. So it's just to say, this is the time for Tibetans to be more proactive and to change strategies. In my thinking, I speak under correction, looking at different ways to handle issues of resilience, becoming more proactive, becoming more and more involved. The world is on virtual space. invest more on the Tibetan film industry that tells the Tibetan story on cinemas all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
People don't have time to read publications and so on, but they have time for small videos on their phones. Go into people and start lobbying as China lobbies to expand. Tibetans should start lobbying to be recognized. It's the era and the time that we live in. So it's all about new method of doing things, new ways of doing things. So far, the resilience has been good, because if Tibetans have not been truly resilient, they will have been crushed. But because they still exist today, it means the will of God for them is to live as a nation. And I can tell you, they are able to do that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Atta. I want to now quickly screen this picture. Are you able to see this picture?
Yes, I see it properly.
Okay. Thank you. So, as we know that for over last 70 years of Chinese occupation of Tibet, when people inside and outside continue to fight for freedom, most importantly, I believe it is Tibetan people inside Tibet. And we are standing in solidarity with their fight. They are the ones who are every day fighting against the repression of the Chinese military and Chinese government and the system. But despite that, people are rising up. So this is a website which had put up some of the images of 2008 uprising that happened almost like 12 years ago, where Tibetans from all the three provinces has joined, the Tibetan resistance. You can see this map here. See, so the northern part of the map, which is usually not habited, it's a barren land, but wherever there are people are habited. You can see in this map like how across the Tibetan towns, cities, and villages, thousands of people stood to the street and fought for the freedom and called for the end of Chinese occupation. And it is still continuously happening. So you can see like thousands of people came out in the street in this call for freedom, from monks to nuns to college students to high school students to to nomad to farmers to businessmen. Everyone has called for freedom. So I would now like to end this call with this image, which I feel every time I look at this image, I feel like very, very inspired, and it keeps me going, hopeful for our struggle. So this is an image where Tibetans in Tibet, in this protest, they took down the Chinese flag and raised the Tibetan flag. And of course, they pay a very, very high cost. In this uprising, many Tibetans were killed, many people lost their life, but they kept the resistance up, and they continue to stand up against the injustice. And I hope, the dream of Tibetans will come true when we will raise Tibetan flag in Tibet once again, without China.
It will come true. Nobody ever expected that apartheid will end, even though the external forces like the Cold War and all its impact on the entire political landscape is the same thing. There is never any time in history where there is political stagnation. Like the United States came at some point to be the power hegemony. Other nations in time had assumed such role. And that is what China is struggling to achieve, the global hegemony. But nobody stays at that position forever. It always changes. But the danger, if we allow China to become the global hegemon, is that all of us are going to die. That I can assure you. You see the incidents from Wuhan that closed all international borders, closed all airports, and make all of us to be panicking at home. If we allow China to get to that point where it makes decision for the entire global political landscape, we are in serious trouble. Look at the World Health Organization. Immediately, United States pulled their phone off. China gives more than what US has been offers, more than what the US has been offering to take the WHO and put in its pocket. It's the same thing they are doing with all these other organizations. So it is time for Africa to join its strength with the Tibetan. To say injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere.
Thank you so much, Atta. I learned so much today from you, and I look forward to, work with you, learn from you in terms of how we can build this collaboration together for Tibet and African countries. Thank you again, and please keep your spirit high and strong. And I know you are having a event on Confucius very soon. A further discussion on Confucius Institute. So I think what you are doing is really making a big change and inspire us to continue to work together. So thank you so much and take care, my brother.
Thank you. Thank you, my brother. Keep well.
Yeah. Okay. I have some announcements, so Ada, I will let you now leave. Wait a second. Okay. So we just concluded our discussion with Atta from South Africa. It was about the learning from Tibet's occupation and how we can strengthen Tibet relation with African countries and how we can challenge China together. I think it is really important time. It is a historic moment, and it is time for Tibetans and Tibet activists and supporters across the world to work together now to stand up against China. So having said that, we're going to conclude our talk here. But before we sign off, I just want to share a petition that we had, Students of Free Tibet has launched yesterday. So the petition called for stand with India against China's aggression. So we know that China has continuously attack not only now Tibetans who are under the occupation, but as well as it has crossed beyond its boundary, and right now there's a standoff between India and China at Indo-Tibet border. Historically, there was no border with China and India. It was Tibet and India border. So in the recent attack from Chinese military, over, I think, at least 20 Indian soldiers has lost their life. So we pay our tribute and condolence to the courageous Indian soldier. But at the same time, we call now international community to speak up and rise up against China's the attack on Indian sovereignty, and as well as the ongoing occupation in Tibet. So we launched this petition. You can see here 190 Tibetans have, Tibet supporters and Tibetans have, and especially a lot of Indians had signed this petition. So please help us to share, especially with all your Indian friends and supporters. We want to raise this petition. We directed this petition to the recently formed Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. So Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China is a global parliamentary network that was founded on June 4th. We directed this petition to the Interparliamentary Global Network and other world leaders. So you can see Interparliamentary Alliance on China was formed on June 4th. I think this is something that to let people know. So under Interparliamentary Network, there are parliamentarians from all the world has now come together to work together to stand against China and to protect freedom and democracy. So as of now, there are over 100 parliamentarians have joined this network. So we are calling all the parliamentarians, members and other world leaders to speak up against China and to actually to make statement against China's aggression. So our key goal and ask for this petition is to urgently ask leaders to make public statement to condemn China's military invasion of Indian territory. As world leader, and particularly India should lead it, and world government should now recognize Tibet as a separate and historical independent country that remains under China's illegal occupation. And at this most recently tragedy demonstrate that China's occupation of Tibet is a threat to the international peace and security. And we are calling our Indian brothers and sisters, saying Tibet's freedom is India's security. We are with the Indian brothers and sisters against China's aggression, but we want now India and Indian government and parliamentarians to recognize Tibet as an independent and occupied country, and then only like we can stand up against China. We also call for international community to support Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Tseten Mongolians, and Taiwanese people to fight against the Communist Chinese Party colonial practice and expansionism. And finally, we call international community must join Indian grassroots movement to boycott Made in China. There's a whole grassroots movement that has started in India, and we want international community to join Indian-led grassroots movement to boycott Made in China and raise economic pressure on China. So we have made this petition in English, in Hindi. You can see we have in Portuguese and Vietnamese. We are getting translation of in Japanese, in French, and other languages. So we want to make it truly global, and we want to share this petition to across the world international community to stand with India and stand with Tibetan freedom struggle. So please help us to share this petition. I will say last few words in Tibetan. Tanda nganzu chudu tsawa chesasti ta tanda Africa ge nanglol yuebe tanda leguwa nyamdola nganzu ge ani pedun tapzo da tande chala jana ge Africa nanglola kangi khari chagi suguyeme penjo gu tone nushu mangu shuchi leguore jana ge Africa lungbe ge perka ngodun cheche saja piju che ani memala thupso tandene mangu shuchi yungyo di Africa lingchen di nanglola gyakap shipchu ngapchu ngapshi yore ngapchu ngapshi nanglola mangbuchi nanglo di tsowa shukchumbu leguore andegi tuzu nega dede zara chumwa kapsula nganzo ngone ani pepe tabzo di ta nupcho gyakapre takanashi Asia gyakapre Africa gyakapre tsangma nyamdola ngazo lega cheche ani mimangda ani takanashi shungda tsangma nyamdo ngazo lega chegoe di pemisi kechimburre gyabjo tsangmani ngazo ya langgoe da pyodun chira shukchumbu chegoe di kechimburre desongsa ngazo tanda lesende chewa yi ani lesende inji nanglo cheware miyu tso di ngazo gi Africa nanglo pepe gyabjo wa mangkang mama sotuya gi miyu chadigdu ta tanda nge sera shuwe di depar nalo siya di nyeja tada gyana da gyaga sansamla kange chungu yore ta di sansam di pyoge sansam chadig yore gyana mangmi gi gyaga nyam nyedo kare ta mangmi nyamdo la chuzin sho che tande chala sanju koe che wana gyaga mangmi nishu la se de rong ching yore te songsa nganzo gi zata gi tone tale gyaga che to ene nganzo gi gyabjo ta ta kana shi gyana gi ani tande gi di 자주 년바들라 ngogo tone ani ngazu de senda durup지 자gia tone ngazu do stang yu tande chala min yiga masimske senda gyapsasha ta zodi senda durup din nanglola zambulingi guji lakbado yagala ngazu gi shui zodi tande chala ngazu senda durup di gyune yaga memanda shungyamdola ngazu dungsin nyamge yowada 개체쇼 찍대 간속에 고든 시요 고든 당보디 아니 단대 야나게 야갈 진주 체발나 칸다 산삼나 녀라 중에들 잠불링 야컵다 슝 라바도 구티 속에 아니 야나라 균주게 토네다 작담 빼고기스 니바데라 아니 야가 슝레 야가게 trozo레 다가나 시 잠불링게 슝 이게 토네다 베디 야컵 타데치다 진주게 야컵지 야나 월라 진주유베 야컵지 임바 문지 쇼고고 요스라는 것도 고든 뜨요 다 디레지 제투바이나 아니 신의 야나라 딱 오네 칼 탑조라나 갑자기 초우레 야간 미만나로 단다 초와침보 쉬우여서 아니 가란서 무튼이 쉬어야들라 아니 벽이 라와랑제디 야가게 된자디 차그래 단다 야가다 야나게 라네다 코나서 산삼나로라 마 강에 체에 벽 전주 체여서 강에 들에 체교를 때 마제버 톤에 벽이 내던데 인지미지 잡조 제고 요왔다 디 균에 아니 야가게 내단데 숙치야 야 슈트웨게 내단 자기 왕아주 슈유 대대냠도 다 벽잠 마세 위구 홍콩 또 속보 테메 야나 미리 tamangzodenye wa changmala dos chimazo yapjo chegu dos lan shu yana ge masho la ngazo tan tabje chewa kapsula dina shin tama de la ani 항상게 개치 보통 것도 대송사 아니 참매기 되돌아 yapjo 나로 나가 쉬어이 라소 안 대가랑이 드링기 먼저 레세데 대가랑 주죽지 치와체 아니 상말라 탐 양자 투체나 쉬어이 거리체